Today, next we're going to talk about thematic information and non-thematic information. Every discourse has a basic theme line, which is intended to be the most prominent part of the text. And most discourses also include non-thematic material, which is also sometimes called background material. And non-thematic material is generally a short embedded text or a clause or a sentence or a group of sentences, which may be of a different text type than the main theme line. So in a narrative text, which again is basically to tell a story, the thematic material is the main event line. It's the series of events. It's what actually happened. It's the plot. And non-thematic material in narrative text is added to make the main series of events easier to understand. It's not really crucial to advancing the plot forward. It identifies characters. It describes settings. It sometimes speaks of alternate possibilities that don't actually happen. It could give the perspective of some of the participants, or it may give the narrator's personal ideas and experiences. So here's an example of theme and non-theme from Genesis chapter 12. Now you see that I have the theme line in the left-hand column, and I have the non-thematic material extracted out and put in the right-hand column. So we can read it straight down and follow along with me. I will read both sides, both columns together. Starting with verse 4. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. Verse 5, he took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and he took the servant people they had acquired in Haran and set out for the land of Canaan and arrived there. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Now, an explanation of the non-thematic material in this passage could be as follows. First, as the Lord had told him. This statement is not the next event in the theme line as the passage goes. It's an explanatory flashback. It's going back and saying that the Lord had previously told Abram to leave, and the narrator is supplying this background information about Abraham's journey. And it says, Abraham was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. Again, this does not reflect an event on the theme line. The narrator is giving us some additional explanatory information about the main participant, Abram. It's not the next thing that happened. The next point in the non-thematic material, it says they had accumulated, talking about possessions. They didn't accumulate possessions at this particular point in the narrative. They had previously accumulated those possessions before this narrative started. So this is another flashback. And then the same with they had acquired people in Haran. And during the time that Abraham was in Haran, they apparently acquired some servants who ended up accompanying him and his wife and his nephew Lot when they eventually left Haran and continued on toward the promised land. And then the last point under the non-thematic material, it says, at that time, the Canaanites were in the land. So again, the narrator is furnishing some explanatory information just to give us a little bit more of the setting for this narrative. Now, there are a couple of common tests for non-thematic material. One common test is that it can often be left out and the narrative will still make sense. Of course, with scripture translation, no information can ever be left out. The point is that the theme line can stand alone without the non-thematic information. Semantically, it often still makes sense, and linguistically, it will often flow correctly and naturally. Now, that's not to say that non-thematic information is unimportant. It may be extremely important to correctly understand the narrative, but it doesn't advance the theme line, the series of events, forward. So the left-hand column represents the theme line. If we read straight down on that column, it makes sense semantically. It doesn't sound like it's missing something, and it also does not sound incomplete linguistically. Okay, so look at Genesis 12, verses 4 through 6 again. And this time I'm going to just read the theme line side. I'm going to just read the thematic information. I'm going to leave the non-thematic information out. Again, I'm not suggesting that you leave out any information when you translate, but I want you to see that semantically it will not sound incomplete, and grammatically it will not sound incorrect. So this is the theme line of these few verses. So Abram went, and Lot went with him. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all the possessions, and he took his servant people and set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. Another feature of non-thematic material is it can often be moved from one place to somewhere else within the narrative without affecting anything else. And again, I'm not saying we would just arbitrarily move information around, but there are some times in translation where many English versions have moved some of the information just because it fits better. Non-thematic material can sometimes be disruptive, even to the point that it can obscure some of the elements of the theme line. And obviously in Scripture, the non-thematic statements were placed at exactly the right place. But when we translate into another language that works differently from the source text, it's sometimes advisable to move some of the non-thematic material to make it less disruptive to the cohesiveness of the theme line. Consider the example of Mark chapter 15, verse 21. This verse contains quite a bit of non-thematic material. So again, you see that I have placed the theme line on the left, in the left-hand column. The non-thematic material is on the right. And you see that only the very beginning of the verse and the very end of the verse are thematic. The rest of it, everything in the middle, is non-thematic. So it starts out by saying, they compelled a man who was passing by, who was named Simon. He was from Cyrene. He was coming in from the country. He was the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry Jesus' cross. Now, some English translations, like the English Standard Version, follow the Greek ordering. So in Mark chapter 15, verse 21 in the ESV says this, and they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. Now, this is understandable in English. It's not real natural, perhaps. The New Living Translation decided to move some of the non-thematic material. So here's how this same verse reads in the New Living, in the NLT. It says, a passerby named Simon, who was from Cyrene, was coming in from the countryside just then, and the soldiers forced him to carry Jesus' cross. Then parentheses, Simon was the father of Alexander and Rufus. Now, there are two significant aspects of the way that the New Living Translation handled this verse. First of all, they moved some of the interruptive non-thematic material to the beginning of the verse and some of it to the end. Remember that when we looked at it in Greek, in the source text, all of the non-thematic information is right in the middle, and the theme line is one clause at the beginning and one at the end. But secondly, I think the most significant part of the NLT wording is that the translators placed the two thematic propositions adjacent to one another to highlight the direct link between them. Every language has its own way of handling non-thematic information. If we fail to understand the grammatical signals of our target language and the way that they would deal with and mark non-thematic information, we may miscommunicate or may cause confusion to the hearers. Consider this example in Mark chapter 1, verses 4 through 7. Again, you see I have the theme line on the left-hand column, and I have the non-thematic information on the right. So starting with verse 4, it says, John appeared baptizing in the wilderness and proclaiming. Now John was clothed with camel's hair and wore a leather belt around his waist and ate locusts and wild honey. And he preached, saying. Now, I left verse 4 out of there, but it's really part of the theme line as well. Now, I've seen instances where a verse like this could be translated in such a way that the non-thematic information seemed to the hearers and the readers like it was actually part of the theme line. If they weren't aware of just how their target language marks non-thematic information, that can happen to an uninitiated native speaker who was not involved in the translation process. So I've actually worked through a translation where the way that they would read the translation in the target language, and then I would ask the mother tongue speaker to explain to me what they just said, and he would come back with something like, okay, John was preaching, and then he put on some clothes made out of camel's hair, and then he put on a leather belt around his waist, and then he ate some locusts, and he ate some wild honey, and then he was preaching again. Of course, the problem here is that the non-thematic material sounded to this hearer as if it was part of the theme line. So when he tells it back, he's telling it back as if these are theme line events. That's why it's so important that we understand how our target language marks and handles non-thematic information so we don't confuse our readers, so that it's very clear what the theme line is and what the non-thematic information is. And it might be difficult for you to imagine how that kind of confusion could come about, but it is very much possible because other languages work very, very differently from English and from Greek and from Hebrew. Non-thematic material in narrative text is most often explanatory in nature, where the narrator is telling us something about the participant or about the setting, or maybe telling us the perspective of the participant, the attitude of the participant. But sometimes in narrative text, the narrator may be injecting a non-thematic comment that is actually hortatory in sense. And here's an example in Mark chapter 13, verse 14. It says, "But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be," then in parentheses, "let the reader understand." Now that is, again, that's an exhortation saying, reader, you need to understand this. So that's a non-thematic exhortation. Today, now we've been talking about non-thematic material just in narratives. Of course, every text has non-thematic material, but non-thematic in other kinds of texts is not necessarily going to be the same as non-thematic material in a narrative text. Today, in hortatory discourse, for example, non-thematic material will likely be explanatory or perhaps even narrative in nature. Here's an example of a hortatory text from the book of Hebrews, chapter 13. So it starts out with verse 7. The Holy Spirit says, "Today when you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts as Israel did when they rebelled, when they tested me in the wilderness. There your ancestors tested and tried my patience, even though they saw my miracles for 40 years. So I was angry with them, and I said, their hearts always turn away from me. They refuse to do what I tell them. So in my anger, I took an oath. They will never enter my place of rest. Be careful then, dear brothers." You see, every line on the thematic side is an exhortation because this is a hortatory text. So that is what we are considering the theme line. It is one exhortation after another after another. But there is extra explanation and even some narrative in the non-thematic side where the author is giving the rationale behind the exhortations of this text. So the first point that we're calling non-thematic, today when you hear his voice, this establishes the context, the setting. Then secondly, it says, as Israel did when they tested me in the wilderness. This is an explanatory comment that's qualifying the first exhortation. Then after that, he went on to say, there your ancestors tested and tried my patience, even though they saw my miracles for 40 years, so I was angry with them, and so forth. And in this case, the author actually quotes a narrative that was given by the Lord in Psalm 95. The rest of the chapter is made up of more exhortations interspersed with supportive, explanatory, and narrative non-thematic material. Now, when we analyze any given text, there may be places where it's not immediately clear whether a particular segment of information is thematic or non-thematic. That's normal. It can take some time to really get an understanding of thematic versus non-thematic, or sometimes there may be more than one way to interpret a particular part of the text. Kathleen Callow made this statement about non-thematic information. She said, "It's not always easy in practice to decide what is thematic and what is not. And in practice, we will probably find a residue, the status of which seems initially uncertain." When we talk about residue in linguistics or in semantics, we're talking about something that we don't really have an answer, a solid answer for. And that's okay. So, a summary of theme and non-theme. Every discourse has a basic theme line. That's true for narrative texts, explanatory texts, and hortatory texts. And there is often non-thematic information that's interspersed between the theme line statements. Every language has its own way of marking the theme line and also its own way of handling non-thematic material in a natural way and in a way that will not be disruptive to the theme line. The theme line in narrative will likely be handled differently than the theme line in other kinds of texts. When we study language, discourse, and every level, it's essential that we differentiate between the form of the message and the meaning of the message. The meaning is universal. It's the same in every language, but the form is very much language specific. Each language will have its own forms. So the meaning includes things that we've talked about here, such as the communication situation, which is superimposed over the forms. The meaning also includes the purpose or the author of the speaker. These need to come through. It also includes the semantic interrelatedness of information, which is what we call semantic cohesion. It's the fact that the content itself is semantically interlinked. It also includes the meaningful transition, which is the semantic boundaries. And it also, the meaning also includes the designation of information as either thematic or non-thematic. Now, on the other side, the form includes the various ways that each of those semantic elements that I just listed are uniquely handled in each individual language. It's the way each language indicates the purpose of the text, the way each language constructs a narrative and an explanation and an exhortation. It's the way that each language ties sentences together within paragraphs and ties paragraphs together within larger discourse units. And it's the way that each language uniquely marks boundaries between paragraphs or between larger discourse units in a series of paragraphs. And it's also the way that each individual language marks the main theme line of the text and the way each language naturally inserts non-thematic information. So the implications for translation are that the meaning, which is the semantics, must be reflected in translation. Every bit of the meaning must come through in translation. But we need to keep in mind that many aspects of the form from the source text from any given language will not be reflected when that text is translated into another language, because the target language will have its own unique forms, which may be very different from the forms of the source text. It is essential that every cross-cultural communicator develop a clear understanding in their mind of the distinction between the meaning of the message and the form of the message. The meaning is universal across all languages, and the forms are unique to each individual language. In order to clearly delineate between meaning and form, we need to have two totally separate lists of terms. And each of these two lists form a sort of organizational hierarchy where the smaller units join together to form larger units. So there is a hierarchy of form on the grammatical side, and there's a hierarchy of meaning on the semantic side. Now, from the time that we first studied grammar in school, we learned that there is a grammatical hierarchy with grammatical categories and grammatical terms. For example, a simplified list would be something like this. Words join together to form sentences. Sentences join together to form paragraphs. Paragraphs join together to form chapters, and chapters join together to form stories. But when we study discourse, we need to focus on two distinct hierarchies, each with its own list of terms: the grammatical hierarchy with grammatical terms and the semantic hierarchy with semantic terms. If we try to use the grammatical terms to describe the semantics, it will cause problems because, as we've noted, the semantics is universal. It's consistent across all languages, but the grammar is very much language specific. It's potentially different in every language. So in semantics, for example, we talk about semantic things and semantic events. In grammar, we talk about nouns and verbs. But if we use the grammatical terms noun and verb to describe the semantics, it will cause problems. Let me give you an example. Semantic things includes all animate beings, both natural and supernatural. For example, man, bird, angel, God. And semantic things also includes all inanimate entities. For example, book, tree, water, moon. On the grammatical side, we might say that semantic things are usually nouns, but some grammatical nouns are not semantic things, and that's where we will cause ourselves problems if we don't keep that in mind. For example, in the sentence, "the journey is long," the word journey is a grammatical noun. It's the subject of this sentence. But semantically, it's an event. It's an action. It's not something that I could carry on a conversation with, like a person or God. It's not something that I would put in my pocket for safekeeping and carry around. A journey is something that I do. So semantically, we cannot say that it's a noun. That just doesn't describe it correctly. Grammatically, it may be a noun. It is a noun in English. But what we have to realize, in some languages, they may not have a noun that means journey. They may have to use a verb to describe it. That's why when we describe the semantics, we have to use the semantic terminology and not try to carry the grammatical terminology across. Of course, the meaning is the picture that we envision when we hear a word or an utterance. And when we hear the English noun journey, it creates a moving picture. People walking, riding, possibly carrying things. And as I mentioned, in some other languages, it may not be possible to use a noun to describe the action of taking a journey. So it's essential that we keep the grammatical terms separate from the semantic terms on all levels. Today, there are many other aspects of discourse analysis that we won't take time to delve into here. In these lectures, we've introduced just a few key areas. And when we study language for the purpose of cross-cultural communication, it's essential that we look beyond just the words and sentences and consider how those words and sentences join together to form larger units in our target language. Otherwise, the real message may not come through, and the message that we are aiming to communicate is the most important message in the world.